Tem sido um bocadinho uma surpresa o número de vezes que acabámos por ser convidados para participar diretamente na Bienal. São quase sempre perguntas. Como é que vamos viver juntos? Qual é a vossa luta no caso do Aravena? Há sempre uma inquietação que nos é transmitida e nós, no fundo, trabalhamos a partir dessa pergunta. E aí operamos com aquilo que é sempre muito interessante, que é a nossa liberdade, é a nossa dificuldade. Continuamos a falar de arquitetura, mas, como na arte, não há nenhum problema para resolver. Ter a oportunidade de trabalhar sobre esta dúvida, sobre esta inquietação, sobre esta tensão, no contexto de uma Bienal, é obviamente muito estimulante.
Em 2016 recebemos uma carta do Aravena que perguntava, portanto a pergunta é: qual é a vossa batalha? Eu tinha feito paralelamente um trabalho com outro fotógrafo, o Paulo Catrica, porque tínhamos sido convidados para fazer uma exposição. Eu não conhecia bem o Paulo, mas portanto ele decidiu que iríamos trabalhar juntos. E o Paulo foi lá ao ateliê, acabámos por ir para a Almirante Reis e mais uma vez eu disse: vamos mais uma vez trabalhar em paralelo. Tu vais fotografar este lugar, vais refletir sobre o que é para ti este lugar e nós vamos produzir uma mesa sobre a qual o teu trabalho vai ser exposto e essa mesa tem uma espécie de mapa-síntese do que é para mim aquele território. E o Paulo fez uma coisa que eu até hoje me persegue sobre a condição deste território.
Foi a primeira vez que houve uma secção de arquitetura na Bienal. A Europa-América foi organizado pelo Gregotti, convidou uma série de americanos, arquitetos americanos, e uma série de europeus. Os americanos eram bastante fechados, depois houve um debate muito quente no Lido, onde há um episódio de muita agressividade do Aldo Van Eyck em relação ao Tafuri. O Aldo Van Eyck fez a declaração de que ele era um inimigo da arquitetura. Foi mesmo muito violento e tal.
Estamos na montagem da exposição Casa da Veneza, que abrirá dentro de dias todo o público, num período pós-confinamento, portanto, de volta à cultura, à praça pública. E é curioso a exposição abrir com esta temática, que é a Bienal da Arquitetura de Veneza.
Isto é uma exposição feita a partir da transferência de um arquivo. Portanto, é uma história que, de facto, corresponde ao ciclo da democracia. Por isso é que aqui tem o texto curatorial, não é? Tem uma parede em branco para entrar e depois a cronologia começa do lado esquerdo e a cronologia em si é linear, mas o resto depois não é. O radar, enquanto ferramenta, obriga todos os protagonistas ou todos os elementos na distância a tornarem-se visíveis através do eco. Como é que isto se faz? Ao nível da investigação, faz-se com uma história oral, onde se tenta entrevistar os protagonistas e os observadores destes eventos, com uma cronologia colaborativa que é o elemento vertebrador, é o horizonte do trabalho historiográfico e depois com um trabalho de levantamento de memória visual, gráfica, das coisas que só aconteceram em Veneza. O que é que o público português nunca viu daquilo que da arquitetura portuguesa se mostrou em Veneza? Esse bairro Veneza vai ser feito, de facto, através de desenhos levantados. São desenhos grandes, são desenhos com muito detalhe, são desenhos a 1,15, que nós esperamos que sejam também uma espécie de quase casas de bonecas.
A grande importância desta exposição é permitir olhar para nós, portugueses, para a nossa arquitetura, como ela é vista lá fora, como é que os outros nos veem a nós. E é importante também que nós, enquanto país, consigamos perceber como é que a arquitetura representa Portugal e também deixa Portugal visto aos olhos do mundo.
Eu cheguei lá e vi aquela casa bonita e depois não se podia pôr um prego, portanto tive que inventar uns contrapesos e pôr aquilo tudo no ar. E a minha ideia, como aquilo é tudo falso em Veneza, é uma cidade completamente cenográfica, ventoriana, eu queria abrir um canal, que abrir um canal em Veneza é muito mais importante do que fazer um edifício. Aquilo foi inaugurado sem nenhum espelho, lembras-te disso?
Boa tarde e sejam bem-vindos à Casa.
Good afternoon and welcome to Casa da Arquitectura. This is the second session of the program Radar Veneza, Portuguese Architects in Bienal. To open the session, we have the architect Nuno, the executive director of Casa da Arquitectura. Unfortunately, we don't have audio in the booth for the translation. We will resume as soon as we get audio in the booth. There you go. First and foremost, let me thank everyone here, Nuno, Joaquim, Vanessa.
Muito obrigado pela vossa presença.
Thank you for being here. This is an opportunity that we have starting from an exhibition here in Casa da Arquitectura from the heritage of the Portuguese state about Portuguese participation in the Bienal Veneza. These participations, or from those participations, comes a research made by the curatorship of the exhibition, which is an opportunity that Portugal has of analyzing the way that we have represented on what is the greatest Portuguese representation in Bienal Veneza, which is a privileged space of debate of the world architecture. These representations and the Bienal itself are being rethought, are being redesigned, because of time, the evolution of time. And starting from this exhibition, which is a research about said participations, official participations, and also the presences by invitation of the Bienal itself, that make us look to Portugal and get a future scope on the Portuguese representation in the Bienal. With us today we have our guests, and this is a great opportunity to think about the transformation that these representations have today in the contemporary perspective in this specific Bienal of Venice, Bienal Veneza, but also the experience coming from Nuno. He's in the exhibition and he was also in its participation, more of an institutional scope, such as Jean-Louis, which is quite encompassing in his participation, and Vanessa, she was the curator of Bienal São Paulo, the first one, starting from the tender won by a set of architects, among which were Vanessa. So what we are doing here today, it's a debate, and we encourage the participation so that we can understand what will happen in the future. Thank you. And I would now like to give the floor to Joaquim. So Thank you to our wonderful guests. This event is called From Production to Archive, and more than just presenting in a rush our guests, I would like to explain why are we having them here. Jean-Louis Cohen, he is the star of a parallel story. He was the representative and the head of the French representation. He is part himself of the institutional history of architectural museums, and he is a privileged spectator since '75, a compagnon de route of the Bienal itself. So he is surely someone with whom we have a lot to learn from the side of the production, sure, but also from the invention of an archive of the ephemeral, the memory of something that was made to be erased by the following, which is the great difficulty of this understanding. So they erase their own ballast, they restart. And Vanessa also, she is also the protagonist from a story that we need to learn by contrast. São Paulo Bienal has an institutional history that's different from the Venice Bienal. It has an organic of production that's different, and it has an organic of representation and diplomacy that are radically different, and it also has the selection by Zender. And we've invited Vanessa to do this other story, this other history, this contrast between institutions, because Vanessa has contributed and she was one of the protagonists of the Bienal Veneza. Nuno, he's at the exhibition and he's one of the institutional heads, and he's responsible for having a Portuguese representation in Bienal Veneza. Not just a cultural policy consistent from the Ministry of Culture, regular, systematic, perfectly defined, and that can be assessed, and all the leveraging of taking advantage, and when the opportunity comes, that architecture is part of. Recently, Nuno, he's also a friend, a long-time friend, and he's been trying to do what he calls a museum of the isomatic, a museum that is renewed continuously from the rhizoma, from the constituents, not of the beginning or the end, and someone who clearly has a project of a polynuclear museum, a memory that needs to be differentiated and reorganized permanently. So, not just presenting them, I'm here to share the reasons why we wanted and still want to listen to their guests and to learn from them in this prospective manner. Our conversation will be held in English because of hospitality to welcome our guests. I do apologize. I thought for many years that it was very Portuguese trait, this hospitality of trying to meet the language of others. We've always tried to meet others so that others could feel right at home. Then I got to know Jean-Louis Cohen, and I understood that it was an amazing hospitality, but it was not Portuguese at all, because the ability of making everyone feel at home, and the ability to listen to almost everyone in their own tongue has been a way of doing things with which many generations, I think, can identify. The maître à penser of many people, and an intellectual to whom I have great intellectual debts. So, without further ado, within this hospitality, and I do apologize for us speaking in English, but this is the way to have a common house to debate. And without further ado, I would give the floor to Jean-Louis.
Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you to Nuno for holding this event in relationship with a wonderful exhibition. I guess it's unfortunately our destiny to have English as a lingua franca and to be using it in our own ways. So we're speaking, in fact, many languages through the filter and the prism of the English language. So I have Joaquim very deliberately refused to prepare us for this conversation. So we've been frantically asking since 2 days for precise indications and orientations, and he totally refused. So what you will see will be the result of a sort of collective improvisation on a theme with a trigger, with a base, and the base is the exhibition next door, which I think deals elegantly, remarkably well with very modest means in terms of what an exhibition is. It deals with a very interesting project which I can see from the other side, from across Spain, thinking about the French experience, which is how in the context of Venice does a country, or the bureaucracy, the cultural bureaucracy of a country, because it's what it is in a ministry or in an institution, how this country wants to represent itself in the worldwide architectural conversation. So whom is in charge of what? And we see in the chronicle, and this will be my first short contribution, then we can go on and discuss the question of the archive. But I wanted to start with the question of the presence in Venice. What is interesting is the very complex adjustment which one perceives here between the general line given by a director of a biennale, which is often nothing more than a slogan. Often it's one line, one motto, and very generally what the surrealists called the mots valises, i.e. words which have a very broad potential content, but can also hold lots of vacuum. And in this mot valise, which is given by the director of Biennale, one sees attempts to respond. And I think in this case, Vanessa was also engaged with me in doing the French pavilion in 2014 with the Biennale of Koolhaas. This was a success because Koolhaas went behind the mot valise. To give another example, another metaphor, my perception of Venice Biennale very often is that of a sort of zoo in which every country has a cage, and in every cage there is an animal, and it's a complete cacophony. With Koolhaas, the paradigm seemed to be more the paradigm of an orchestra. Every country playing a different musical instrument and some more or less articulate sound coming out of it. But in other cases, it's guesswork. So the national participations are attempts, very difficult diplomatic attempts at giving a role to people who are supposedly representative and at the same time to respond to the motto of the Biennale. So what we see is how, and I think I would love to see the same thing about the French presence or the German presence or
the Russian presence, which is each time inflected by this sort of mutual adjustment of a national space to a vague motto and to also a certain sense of pluralism and justice. You cannot, even if countries have a national champion, you know whom I'm thinking of in this city, this champion cannot be on stage every other year. You need to give a view of a certain plural view. So what I understand is a very complex a task you've had, Joaquim, in trying and succeeding in giving a sort of retrospective coherence to a series of strategic and also tactical decisions. Mm-hmm. So this, of course, raises the question of the archive, what you had to deal with, where is this memory kept, but I leave it for a further stage of the conversation.
Vanessa, a little bit of institutional history for the contrast.
Yes. So I'll have to, well, thank you so much, Joaquim, for inviting me to participate in this debate. And it is true, as Jean-Louis mentioned, that I had the opportunity to reflect with him about this tension between national representation and globalization, which is the motto that Koolhaas tried to orchestrate within that specific context of the National Pavilion. So it was a very interesting reflection. And a few years later, I had the opportunity to participate in the first open call for a curator of the São Paulo International Architecture Biennale. And so in order to tackle that competition, I'll give you a bit of institutional history, and it's actually a history that is Italophile and Italian, in fact. It's so the Biennale of Architecture of São Paulo was, like in Venice, connected to the Bienal of São Paulo, which is the Art Biennial. It used to be a session of the Art Biennial. And why is this an Italian history? Because it was idealized by Cicilio Matarazzo, which was an industrialist from São Paulo, a kind of patron of the arts, like others, part of the kind of industrial elite of São Paulo. And he is one who idealized the Museum of Art, of Modern Art, MUM. And he's really behind this idea of doing a Biennale in São Paulo for the arts that was based on the Venice Biennale. And there was an architectural. So this was one of the first Biennales done at the image of the Venice Biennale worldwide. So it started in '51. That was the first one. The first edition was done in the Trianon, so where today Lina Bobardi's MASP made that place famous in a pavilion that was provisory. And the second one migrated to another one of the endeavors with which Cicilio Matarazzo was implicated, which is the Parque do Ibirapuera. And this is where Niemeyer, of course, designed the complex of these different venues, and one of them is the Biennale Pavilion. So the second Biennale, which was in '54, was not done in the actual Fundação Biennale because it was not ready. It was in two other buildings from the Ibirapuera complex. But from the third edition on, this is where the Biennale used to take place. So it was an event that was related to a building. So it was really in a building that is not, let's say, anodyne. It's a very important building, and it has a very strong characteristic, it's a strong identity, let's say. And architecture was part of it. And in '73, this is the moment where decision took place. So the Architecture Biennale became one of its own that would alternate the model of Venice with the Art Biennial. This was '73, and Paulo Mendes da Rocha was in fact part of the executive committee of that specific, the first one, but was the first and the last within those very difficult dictatorial years. And it was only 20 years after the first when the second Biennale took place, still inside the Pavilion Bienal of Ibirapuera. And this is when Paulo Mendes da Rocha was actually the curator of the second Biennale in a context of course, a democratic, let's say, country. So this was a second Biennale, and the Biennale was taking place, but it was also benefiting from this very, very strong foundation, the Fundação Bienale. So it was run by the Institute of Architects, the São Paulo branch of the Institute of Architects of Brazil, but has this sponsorship and the institutional framework of this foundation that had an international reputation. It was very close to sponsors. And so, and in relation to archives, they also could benefit from that institutional force, let's say. And what happened in relation to the Biennale where I took place was, in fact, a drama and a liberation, because after, benefiting from this strong foundation, on the 9th edition, a scission took place. There was a kind of confrontation between the Institute of Architects of Brazil and the Fundação Bienale for money-related issues. I'm not going to go through there, but there was a huge debt that IAB throughout the years was owing to the Fundação Bienale, and at that point, the two events split. And the 9th edition of the Biennale took place in Oca, another one of Niemeyer buildings, but not anymore in the Fundação, so that was a kind of symbolic move. And from that event on, actually the Parque do Ibirapuera was no longer a venue for the Biennale. And this was when Guilherme Wisnik became the curator of the 10th. And when I say a drama and a liberation is because the Biennale no longer had a venue. So this actually was an opportunity for architects to understand what is the place of that event in the city. Because, of course, Biennale, the way we can understand is an event. I think Venice has a different appeal, but in São Paulo was an event that was somehow restricted to a kind of specific community, but it was also the chance to understand how that event could actually be appropriated by, the citizens of São Paulo, who are the ones who experience the daily, the drama of daily life with which architects should be somehow involved. So the 10th Biennale, Guilherme Wisnik was also one that took place within the context of Occupy Wall Street. And so that whole, 2010, so that whole mouvance was a real drive for him to try to program the city or try to do that and kind of explode the Biennale, and the Biennale would take place in different parts of the city. So subway stations, different museums, so really try to fragment. It was successful, and it was also an opportunity to talk about that whole context of Occupy Wall Street and how architects would respond to that. And the 11th Biennale, but what happened, the outcome of that is that each edition became a drama in terms of fundraising, and a drama to find a venue as well. The 11th Biennale, the curator was Marcos Rosa, and he really aimed to take the Biennale a step further and say, the Pavilion do Ibirapuera, the Fundação Bienale was already like a very elitistic box. The 10th Biennale was also trying to deal within the kind of formal borders of the city, so let's take the Biennale to the periphery. And he was very radical in this gesture. The Biennale went to the periphery, literally, and he tried to program different events, but it got somehow lost. No one knows that the Biennale took place, even among the community of architects of São Paulo, was somehow swollen by a city that has no limits. So it was a radical but very challenging and somehow difficult gesture, a symbolic one. So when the 12th Biennale was announced by IAB, they decided again to promote a very symbolic gesture, because until then the curators there were no clear process of or procedure, or it was always appointed, and it was not a transparent, let's say, appointment. Somehow the curator was announced, and there was no justification for that. Of course, most of them were important figures from that were part of the architectural community. But in 2018, it was also the context of the presidential elections, and Bolsonaro brought the kind of ghost that was related to the first edition of the Biennale, with the dictatorship. That idea somehow, that specific context prompted IAB to launch an international competition. And this is when, of course, based on my curatorial experience, I decided to participate in the call. I was not living in Brazil, and this actually was controversial in a way. even though it was an international open call, because there were Brazilians who were, and 2 other curators, so Charlotte Malterbart, who's French, and Ciro Miguel, who's also Brazilian but living in Zurich. There was a kind of a call into question when we got the competition because we were not based in São Paulo, and it was very somehow controversial because that was an international open call with very neutral members of the jury from everywhere in the world. But there is a kind of a tension between a national history or a very tight international community in São Paulo and and of course the world. And then the drama somehow was a liberation and a drama, as I mentioned, because again, and the topic that we chose for the Biennale was everyday, because we understood that there was a reincidence of the everyday as a kind of conceptual framework among architects in the 21st century. So we wanted, of course, this is a concept that is not new in architecture. We wanted to explore how architects today talk about the everyday productively in the context of global climate change, but also other kinds of discussions in relation to gender, in relation to race, resources. And then again, when we won, and thinking of what Jean-Louis just mentioned about somehow the economy of means of the exhibition that is in the other room, that's when the everyday actually came to a reality, because IAB didn't really have the means and the venue to do the Biennale. So that was a very difficult, of course, and challenging project, but it was one that, and we decided that based on the 2 previous editions, when the Biennale tried to somehow specialize itself in the city, we thought, well, since we don't have the means and you know, somehow we could fall into the trap of being swollen by the everyday, so we said, let's not try to program a city, let's actually try to program one building that encapsulates the city. And for us, back then, was Sesc 24 de Maio, which was the last project that Paulo Mendes da Rocha designed in São Paulo, was really a manifesto for the everyday. So we really wanted to use that venue, and one of the most, the busiest blocks in the city. So we said, let's try to do that. And again, Sesc didn't have the time, but we managed not to have the main exhibition space, but all the ordinary spaces, and we also did the Biennale in Centro Cultural São Paulo. And so, well, it was, the everyday was not only, well, we did an open call, an international open call, so we had 70 projects that were showcased in Centro Cultural São Paulo, and we invited 10 architects to work that we thought were somehow representative of that move towards everyday to work, but many of them were European or North American based, and they actually realized that was not only a concept, but was a reality. And it was hard for them to actually adjust to the budget, but we managed to do that. And we had the confirmation for the venue from Sesc 3 months before the Biennale opened. So it was really a race against the clock. But in terms of the archive, so what I can say is that once the Biennale, once the decision took place, IAB is doing its best to try to also present that history and build that archive. So there was a real endeavor, you know, they built, and also was not only a new method or a way to select its curators, but it was a very young crew that was in charge of the Biennale, so they had other expectations in terms of democratizing that archive. So they built a website, and it was a major concern for them to kind of create that lineage. Of course, part of that lineage goes back to the Fundação Bienal, and Fundação Bienal, of course, is also part of that archive. And when for us, they didn't have the budget to build to sponsor a catalog. So what I did was immediately once we were nominated, I didn't even know if the Biennale was taking place. So what I did was send a project to the Graham Foundation, and that's what actually guaranteed that we did the book. And this is the kind of, it's not an archive, it's a spin-off. We don't have a catalog, but this is a way to kind of somehow seize that endeavor in the form of this more theoretical book. And but yeah, this is where the story is. And there will be and then there is a new Biennale taking place the following year, and they decided to change again. But I'll leave the story there. Yeah.
We have an earlier beginning. We have a leaner production, a better relation with the city. We have a lot of things to envy to, São Paulo Biennale, and I'll let it, But I think Jean-Louis is probably already gearing up to some contrast, but I think Nuno can contribute.
Well, yes, I would like to grab something you said, very interesting about São Paulo, to talk about the context of Venice. I mean, you said São Paulo is a city with no limits, and I would say that Venice is a city with no time, or with a suspended time, let's say. And it was always a question for me, an interrogation mark, to know why, to guess why there is such a variety of events, of contemporary cultural events like the Venice Art Biennale, so old in time, but also the Cinema Festival and also the Architecture Biennale held there. I mean, it's maybe the most difficult place in Europe to hold a Biennale. I mean, it's very difficult in logistical terms. I mean, and we must be honest, the Biennale, both Biennales are meant business for the city. I mean, so the context, it's very well drawn, drawn. I mean, it's but so much for the context. I mean, it's historically, when you ask yourself why, I mean, both in terms of the independence of that territory, historically speaking, in terms of the specificity, the geographical specificity, I think it's a rather wonderful place to think about the future or the presence of the artistic creation, let's say it like that. And that's why we like so much to go to Venice, and that's why we like so much to meet other artists, fellow curators, fellow architects, etc. But there is to be, I would say, a circumstance, and the circumstance is this will or this obligation to make part of it and to anyhow try to export your artistic I would say values or your artistic expression or such. And of course, Jean-Louis emphasized that. I mean, and we talked yesterday. We were talking a little bit about the debates today, and there is a contradiction in this context. I mean, because there is a contradiction in time and a contradiction in trace, because it's, of course, an ephemeral event. It's a kind of a party, and then I'm not so sure what remain of all of these economical, intellectual effort. So, and also there is an even more considerable contradiction, which is a form of national representations in a time more and more distant of or needed of this, that needs this kind of I would say identitary values. So, which will bring me to the exhibition. I think the exhibition, it's a very clever and a very courageous effort. Not only because all the things Vanessa and Jean-Louis said before, and I will not repeat, but also because it's, I think it's a political exhibition. Because it brings to the public space it raises a lot of questions, it systematizes those questions, namely what's a national representation, what can be a national, if it exists, a national form of architecture or art. Well, we know the answer, but also how do you organize? How do you choose, and how do you sustain then the questions or the conclusions you came with all of this effort made by curators, architects, artists, whatever. And this is the true archive of the Portuguese representation throughout the Biennale, because the state, the Ministry of Culture, which by the way only exists in Portugal since '97, with an interruption after, I think it's not doing his job, and I think this gap of 1 year, art architecture, it's not the state and institutions which are responsible of organizing these events doesn't take any conclusion of what happened the year before, only, and maybe in a very short notice, prepare the year after. So I hope that this exhibition, and talking with Nuno, and I hope that this exhibition will bring, will make possible a true debate about what's the purpose and then what's the goal. I mean, so the last thing I'd like to say in this first intervention is that the art Biennale or the art context, the contemporary artistic context is very different from the architectural context. So I would say that the notion of representativity in the architectural Biennale, it's rather different from, because it has a collective sense as opposed to an individual sense of the artistic Biennale. And therefore it's much more complex, I think. I would say that in 2001, or 2000, I don't remember quite well, when 2002, sorry, when the Contemporary Art Institute explored the possibility of having a Portuguese representation to the Architecture Biennale. I think it has to do at the time with those notions, because the artistic context produces its own visibility. It's inherent to its condition, you know. And the architectural field, which was starting to develop a notion of presence in the artistic institutions and claiming for a presence, claiming for a mediation, rather more than its own existence in the public space. I mean, our representation, our first official representation, came out of that debate, and opened also that debate. But I'm not very optimistic about all of these contradictions, and I truly wait. And I expect from this exhibition, this effort, and this archive, which came from 2 dossiers, you know, as you mentioned. I hope that we start to discuss with this solid basis, this solid ground of what are we expecting from. If we are looking at the mirror to explore the metaphor of the national representation with Sotomora that you curated and José Gil, or if we want to build a kind of an archive of the present and to prepare the future. I mean, I think it's the role of museums, of other forms of creating visibility and legibility, let's say it like that.
Louis, you want to?
Well, I think one of the important points among many made by Nuno is the difference between art and architecture. It's true that the category of the national in architecture is grounded in different terms, in cities, in physical shape about which narratives can be proposed. And so I think all these big manifestations, we have to think for a second about this notion of Biennale and the incredible success of Biennale, biennials or triennials. In my view, they have replaced what the salon used to be in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Regular events in which the ongoing production of the artistic discipline could be measured by the critic, appropriated by more or less large audiences. So the salon have vanished and the Biennale have proliferated. Or the Triennale, São Paulo is an established one, but we have seen recently one popping up in Chicago, another one in Oslo, one in Lisbon, one in Lyon, which seems to be a total failure, another one in Moscow. So I think there is a sort of orgy of Biennale or Triennale, which is a little surprising, but in a context in which salons have vanished, in which also the journals, the magazines have lost their relevance. We are no longer waiting eagerly the publication of a monthly issue of a main magazine. We vaguely, this is a little fictitious, but we surf on the sites to see what is going on, or through our Facebook threads, but the role of exhibitions in which one can still see actual models, actual pieces of buildings, films in real scale, is, I think, very, very problematic today. And the function of, and I'm again returning to Venice, what is striking for me, I don't know if it's the same for the Art Biennale. If we look at what is the real audience of a Biennale in Venice, it's more or less, I think it's a sort of median figure, more or less 50,000 people, except with COVID, during the opening weekend, 50,000, in which, of course, the entire milieu meets itself, congratulates itself, plans future Biennale and other events. So it's 50,000 together packed in one weekend, and then 150,000 over a period of 4 months. completely diluted. So it's a very particular type of audience, which is essentially, I would say it's a professional and largely a general audience during that period. So that's the audience of a Biennale. And here comes in, the archive comes in, and I wanted to shift a little bit to the second term of the discussion, the archive, i.e. what is kept, what is transmitted, what is left behind. Is there a paper trail? Is there a video trail? Is there a trail of models? What is left of the Biennale and of the exhibitions, the ephemeral exhibitions in general? And I could speak of many cases. We could take one major show exhibition of the 20th century, the exhibition of the decorative arts in Paris in 1925. Almost everything vanished, but some pieces were rebuilt in other contexts. Some collections developed out of this exhibition, which is held at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs and will be the base of the centennial celebration in a sort of auto-referential pattern. What is left of the New York World's Fair of 1939? Basically one big model, and that's all, but the memory of the Futurama by Norman Bell Geddes is still continuing. So in a way, I would say that all these exhibitions are moments of crystallizations of ideas, of forms, of images which later migrate to all sorts of media. They're a sort of condensing lens which then, for rays of light, which then are propagated into faraway space. With an explicit archive or without it because of the variety of productions made.
But, and I think that in one thing it's very, very curious because evidently the architecture arrives at the Venice Biennale because the head of visual arts is an architect and says, okay, I'll take the head of visual arts as long as I can mobilize architecture to, the party, or mobilize architecture to discuss the city that we can offer, take the opportunity in a very proactive, and that was the big change. Gregotti was, very Feuerbach. We don't have to explain the world; we have to change it, and this is probably.
Someone said it before, but
yes, the end of the thesis on Feuerbach that Mies van der Rohe was very fond of putting in the fold of J. I think they all, but this is after the architecture arrived at São Paulo. But São Paulo lives without the specter of the national representation, which is of course in.
Probably no, but there used to be national presences, and there are still. No.
And I have to say that actually when I started architecture and I went to, I think the fifth, or my first was the fourth Architecture Biennale in São Paulo, in the pavilion. And you have to understand also, you have to put yourself in the perspective of, I don't like the term, but the global south. And when I was a student of architecture, as Jean-Louis said, the Biennale was really an opportunity for the architectural community in Brazil, but especially in São Paulo, to have access to the international scene. It was really a showcase of, I remember Zaha Hadid, I mean, there were all the super Dutch and all everything to which we had access only through national, there was no internet, so it was really the local architectural magazines. We could not have access to international magazines. They were too expensive. And very few would be able to go to a Venice Biennale. I mean, I haven't been to the Venice Biennale until the moment I worked in the pavilion, just to give you a sense. So it was really an opportunity to showcase, to bring the world. And the Fundação, the Art Biennale was a very international event, has always been since the beginning. I mean, the first Biennale of São Paulo, that's when Max Bill won the prize. So Mário Pedrosa, who was an art critic, he was really attuned to, there was a moment, the 50s in Brazil, there was a kind of a very strong international, let's say, endeavor at that moment. But of course, with the country had a kind of tournée sur soi with their dictatorship. There was a moment of closing, and after the opening up, the Biennale became this kind of big showcase where Brazilian architects would have the opportunity, because the international architects could afford coming to Brazil, but not the other way around, as much as it is a very elitistic profession. And I would say that from the moment, as I say, was an opportunity and a drama, because I think that when the Architecture Biennale became orphan and lost the patronage from the Fundação Biennale, somehow was also a moment to think of how to use that opportunity to think critically, the same way as Gregotti actually. How can we leave a trace of that event, of mobilizing a community to think of, São Paulo, with all the problems, with which architects have a lot of trouble to cope, because we know what, Brazilian cities, how architects actually relate to the periphery. I mean, there is no space for architecture because, there is a lot of space for architecture, a lot to do, but it's very difficult to, to build. And so that's a moment of self-reflection. I think that, even the Occupy Wall Street, really thinking about how to, first of all, bring that event to a kind of collective imaginary, no longer a specialized community, but perhaps it would be not a material trace, but it would be really an idea of what architecture does, what it is. Let's go to the subway stations, etc. We can say, well, we don't know if it was or not effective, but it was there. And for that moment on, I think there was that kind of idea. Perhaps could it be a material trace? Perhaps it could be something that would, and I think in this way, when I read the catalog of your exhibition, going back to the beginnings of the Venice Architecture Biennale, I think there was this same endeavor that I would say that in the 3 last editions of the Biennale, how can we really mobilize the international community to seize this specific city? And when we thought of programming Sesc 24 de Maio, I think that building is very, very strong for the way it is a kind of a, I like to think of America as no loitering, is a loitering building, because every floor is part of it's as if you're in a public space, even though Sesc is not a public institution. So we thought that's really the city replicated in many, many levels, and it would be a casual encounter between a public, I forgot the numbers. We had, I think, 10,000 people go to Sesc per day. It's like absurd. For Portugal, in terms of scale, it is, a building that really encapsulates São Paulo of all classes, and it's a really democratic space. So we thought that would be a casual encounter with the Biennale. And I think in terms of the material legacy of a Biennale, I recently read the criticism of someone who was kind of very bitter in the architecture review, I think, talking about this Venice Biennale, saying, well, the latest edition, saying, well, there was nothing that we learned from the pandemic. And this is we realized that this is a word of not endless resources, and that opportunism and narcissism of coming to Venice and, not really thinking about what's happening in the city, the water coming, people who can no longer live in Venice, all of that. It was a very bitter criticism, and I think it goes back to the beginning. How can you really use that opportunity to do something for that city? So this is a question.
But that's a fundamental structural change from being the place to take the pulse to art or architecture, to check novelties. No? The Biennales, if they try to show novelties, they arrive late to the scene. No? And probably they turned into places to produce knowledge, to produce debates, to do something else, I guess. That's a fundamental structural change. Even memory, it was Rem Koolhaas that joked long ago, when memory becomes a value, well, someone will be left out, clearly. There will be a shortage of memory So even memory will have to be an industrial product that we can trade and sell. No? But so it's a big change. Even Rem's Biennale was trying to sell it better. No? That was one of the craziest moments. He extended it twice as long, expecting to have twice as much audience. That's when we learned that there was a ceiling.
It didn't work. He had only 1.2 times more.
Yeah. So, but did it change? No. I mean, you've seen it changing. Even Gregotti was always saying that. No? That there is no the place to tell novelties was no longer there, even in society.
Where is it? Where is it then?
I don't know. I'm asking the question. I'm not. But you think it's still the venue to
showcase novelty?
Yes, or to produce knowledge, to seize the.
Well, the term novelty in itself is problematic.
Yeah.
I would say I would use the term emerging works, emerging ideas. I still think that if you scan a number of such events over a period of, like you've done here, over a period of what, nearly 45 years, you see a sort of desperate late modernists trying to catch up with the world. This is what Gregotti did in 1978. You see the emergence of postmodernists. You see first attempts. I'm thinking of Portuguese Bienal on the Islamic world to be more global and comprehensive. You see many attempts at urbanizing the Biennale and even diluting the discourse in a city-based logoria. This is what Ricky Burdett did. You see attempts at promoting the collectiveness of architecture. This was Chipperfield and Hashim Sarkis this time, and each time you see what sorry to monopolize to keep the microphone, but I've been struck this year by two things. One was the presence of architectural schools. In particular, in the main pavilion, the overwhelming presence of schools. You had the impression that this pavilion was a gigantic pin-up at the end of the school year. And I was also surprised by one interesting shift, because I think that an interesting aspect of the past, let's say, maybe 5 Biennale was the contamination of the architecture presentations by contemporary art. Architects pretending and aspiring at becoming installation artists in a relatively naive way. So that's creating, playing with the repertory of contemporary art in many ways, of arte povera, of performance art, of abstraction, of figuration, of video art, etc. All the entire repertory. And this year, in particular in the central pavilion, I had the feeling of witnessing a paradigm shift from art to science. Instead of being an amateur art show, it was becoming an amateur science display. The paradigm was changing from the art installation to the Museum of Science and Technology, with displays on geography, on nature, on geology, on energy, and with the same amateurish take.
And the schools are actually, I think there's probably a big contrast with the art Biennale, famously, and that I think was always, Gregotti, he tried, no? To make, in 91, with the competition, the invitation to the schools, to have a part of the Biennale that is always a place for the schools to show and show their work.
But one last word on this topic. Maybe Nuno can elaborate on this. There is one major difference between the art and the architectural Biennale. There is a very important agent which is missing in architecture, and this agent are the galleries.
Mm-hmm.
Because the galleries are behind the funding of the artist participation. So the relationship to a market is much more direct in the case of art.
Of course, in terms of a product, artists are showing the product and not an image or a representation of a building or that's a very notable difference, which makes, in terms of what, in professional terms, it makes really the difference, of course.
But I would say that what happened in the last edition of the Biennale reflects also the curator, right? I mean, he's the dean of an institution, so I think it resonates with his own profession. I mean, he's not it's much, and you say, well, Rem Koolhaas is also one that has a double, research-based practice. So of course, his Biennale really reflect that endeavor, and I would say that this last one, that's also the strong presence of schools and somehow was the outcome of that agenda, right? One that promotes somehow academic research.
Because it was delayed, no, it was a lot of a very big internationalism. No, there was a sort of an international of the curators of national representations, trying at least to engage in a conversation. That was evidently COVID-based, probably, but it was a very different situation. And I think we'll be always a bit in debate the question of the national pavilions. You know, we always advocate that we are very, very lucky because we don't have one, so France has
a miserable one.
Yes.
Very modest one.
Mm-hmm. But has one, no? So it's, but it's always a physical structure of exclusion, no? And I'm pretty sure it's been discussed. No? We have here an incredible example of one country that lends its pavilion to another in a form of revolutionary solidarity. So it's, and I think those things are still happening, and probably they are fairly important that they happen. I mean, not all, when you did the French pavilion, you were not doing, you were asking a big question mark. No? You're not doing any sort of celebration of any particular hero, no? Taking the time to, okay, let's work. No? So it's a little bit the point. No? If we have to learn is also to ask what we want to do, where we want to move from here, and what kind of archive. I think it's important what kind of archive we need. Sure. No? I think we all probably have different. I think there's a very important question on archives. We do need to discover what are the most efficient traces or detritus of the present. That I think is a very challenging. You've been dealing with this for so long, no? How you saw it change? What are the traces of the present when you follow them so closely for?
If I may say something about one particular experience, which is the experience of the 2014 French pavilion. This pavilion was 5 rooms in this French building, which was made not by famous architects, because there are buildings in the Biennale Giardini which were made by famous architects. The pavilion of Venezuela by Scarpa, the pavilion of Russia by Shusef before 1914, etc., many more. French was made by the municipal engineer, as if in 1911, as if the French completely neglected and had only contempt for this modest emerging exhibition in confrontation with the splendor of the world capital of culture, which was Paris, of course. So French made a very modest pavilion. inside the presentation we developed had one model of the house of design for Jacques Tati's film Mon Oncle, which I had made for a previous exhibition, so it was already a recycled elements. There were some actual construction elements. There was a new model of housing development, very difficult one, and a movie. And the meaning of the pavilion was given by video which was continuously running in each room. This was the core object, but it was lost, not physically. It was lost because it was based on, it was a montage in which you had many very short pieces of fiction movie, which are extremely expensive. So the organizers had been able to buy the footage, to buy the minutes for the exhibition, but no longer to show it on the internet. So interestingly, the film, which was the core piece, is nowhere to be seen. I have a mediocre copy on my hard disk. Maybe you have one, but it's lost, and it's only remaining in people's memories and in still photographs. So we shouldn't entertain the illusion that everything is recorded forever now with the means we have. It's not true. What is kept are drawings. So what has been kept, the model has been given to an institution which will show it, but otherwise the message, the integrated message of the pavilion represented by the movie is no longer existing.
And the movie would be the one that would have a longer aftermath, if you think, right? Because I think is the one that is the easiest to preserve, because it's true that the model that we built went to a cultural institution that also speaks of a memory of that building. So, but the film would be the one that would have a longer afterlife, and curiously enough, because we couldn't afford at the time to actually have the rights for a long life, we actually cannot broadcast it anymore. So.
No, you want to add? That's why I was asking the question, because it's archives are always changing. What are the traces? No? Are never evident within the materials of things. The crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm dealing with that presently, building this museum or rethinking the museum of the city of Porto. But I think, first of all, that memory, it's the more present and the more tangible material with which artists work. So, first of all, that. Secondly, I think that we must, of course, we know that, we feel that with our own body now, not only intellectually, we have to reinvent our relationship to memory. We invented it's a modern invention. We invented the anguish of oblivion. It's an European invention. And we forgot how to, that, in nihilo tempore, we used to deal with memory in a human scale. We used to delegate, to transmit memory. It was something that was part of our human condition. So I'm very suspicious about, once again, about all of these institutions or figures or forms of archiving, of keeping memory, which of course are very much needed. All of us knows that. I mean, and are really needed now, presently, to avoid every kind of revisionism, negationism, etc. But at the same time, we need to reinvent our relation to memory, because we know that museums and archives can burn, can disappear, and what will you do then? I mean, if you relate, if you trust so much in your own archives, and you know, we know it quite well, archives are very differently used. You know, sometimes archives are there for our own comfort. So I think museums, I'm talking about museums because it's my subject of work, must deal with it in the sense that they must also be part of this discussion, not only be a comfort zone that doesn't change and avoid or refuses its fragile condition, let's say. Well, it's my contribution to the archive debate, which is a very difficult question, because also the archive puts the question of what the archive can teach you, but at the same time you wonder if the museum of the present, if the decisions you make in biennales, museums, etc., I mean, with different scales and length, must be that you are presenting the zeitgeist, or that you are making how should we say in English, making a statement of what it's more important, or in terms of knowledge or artistic production or intellectual discussions to the future. I mean, so there's an interrogation there, and I would be happy to put this question, because it's an interrogation for us as well.
We can talk about memory, but we should also talk about history.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what you've done here is history.
Mm-hmm.
Is history, and you've been able to do it to make this exhibition, because there are some archives. There are living archives, there are people who can talk,
mm-hmm.
but there are also, there is the Archivio Storico della Biennale, which keeps traces of the Biennale. There are personal archives
mm-hmm.
of architects, which are kept by them or deposited in institutions like this Casa da Arquitectura. So I think the network of places where history can be made on the basis of documents is very significant. If we take, for instance, the work done by Lea Catherine Schatzka, who's one of the contributors to your catalog,
mm-hmm.
a dissertation she wrote at the Bartlett School in London a few years ago. It was on the legendary and perhaps also even infamous 1980 Biennale curated by Paolo Portoghesi, which launched the slogan of the postmodern. She was able to do it because of this mosaic of archives. So I think what is interesting is this sort of cycle, and I would modify the title of this discussion from production to the archive and back to production.
Mm-hmm.
So we're inserted in this place and others in a process of production which is consuming the archive created by past productions.
Mm-hmm.
Not only archives, but also books, right?
Right.
And also the role of the catalog. I think it's one that you.
In the particular history in Venice is actually very beautiful. That architecture and the archive arrived the very same year.
Mm-hmm.
The Archivio Storico delle Arti Contemporanee opened in 1976, the same year then Europa America. It's a it's actually a remarkable coincidence when they find a way to keep trace of what they're doing. And it was, just in simple terms, very helpful also, because the Biennale very seriously of itself and produced yearbooks, like a governing agent or something like that, you know.
They're an ente pubblico, they're a public institution, they have shareholders, they have to give, to report to, it's a state entity. If we stick to the Biennale in Venice, it's a state entity which has to report about the way it spends its money. So we're dealing with major sums of public money.
And the exhibition, they are in the exhibition, they are incredible published archives, the yearbooks. But yes, folding it to the production of the archive, from production to the archive and back, I would open it to the audience. If someone wants to contribute, please. Nuno? Nunus?
Many Nunos in the room. Many Nunos in the room.
No? Yeah, very frightening.
Well, thank you for the nice discussion. I would like to go to something that Jean-Louis referred, which is, I think, history, but mostly oral history, which is also something that this exhibition that you curated is so important about, because you heard the people who had all the difficulties to make a montage in Venice. But when we did the pavilion in 2016, for us it was also very important to listen to the neighbors that live in Álvaro Sisa's neighborhoods, because I think we knew all about those projects, but we didn't know how they were lived by the people inside. And it was so important for us to make those 4 films that will stay. That's the main product of our exhibition, those 4 films that are still online, that you can see them, where people confront the architect himself with what he designed. He has to explain, he has to excuse, he has to listen, he has to confront, he has to almost give an architectural class about what is a facade, why he designed this facade in that way, why does not the bathroom has that window that everybody would like to have. So the oral history that you can create around an exhibition, I think it's one of the most important things that an archive should hold also, because we normally tend to look at ourselves, at our discipline, through the architectural things, but it's also important to listen to people which are somehow what is beyond the architectural or the physic building. And that's why I tend to appreciate every time I see an exhibition on architecture to listen to the inhabitant or the client about the building and how was the relation with the architect and how the architect confronts himself with what he has done. And sometimes it's very difficult for an architect to go back to the scene of the crime, which Caesar did in 2016, hardly, but he did it. So in a way, that was for us one of the big conquers of this exhibition, is to see the architect in the space and somehow confronting himself with his own creation, the creator confronting the creation.
Yes, it's a case in which the archive was the building. But I couldn't agree more on the importance of oral history and interrogations and conversation with protagonists of any kind of practice. If you look at architecture, I'll give a silly example, but I'm now developing, I had done some years ago a big research project on architecture during the Second World War, and it yielded a book titled Architecture in Uniform, which is relatively popular. I had left aside the mostly the French scene, thinking that I would return to it later. It was 2010, 2011. And now I'm back at work trying to write a history of architecture under the Vichy regime, this super conservative, not exactly fascist regime which lasted for 4 years. But in the meantime, all the last witnesses have died. So I find myself at a loss to understand a series of things, because witnesses, protagonists would have told me who was friend with whom, who hated whom, who had lunch with whom, who slept with whom. And so the entire human fabric of history has vanished, because this is not a kind of information I will find in the archives. So long life the living archives.
Yes, there is always and I think Casa da Arquitectura is definitely trying to do also that particular effort to keep the voices.
Yes.
You know,
But again, sorry to add another layer. This shouldn't be left to chance, and maybe should not be left to chance.
Of course.
Let's see what's up. This is, if I may modestly make a suggestion. We have this wonderful Porto School of Architecture, not the building, but the people. And I have in mind a fantastic model, which is the model of the oral history of Chicago's architecture, which has been undertaken maybe 20 years ago. And all, for instance, the former collaborators of Mies van der Rohe, all the people active in the milieu have been systematically interviewed in a scientific way. I mean, a first interview, a transcript, verification of a transcript by the interviewee, etc. And this is now a fantastic body which allows not only to understand how the office of Mies operated, because you have the memories of Fujikawa, of Duquette, of Gene Summers, of Cohen, etc., all the people of the office, but you understand also the conditions of patronage, the building sites. So why don't you do a systematic, maybe it's done, maybe I'm just totally, what I'm saying is irrelevant, but I think it could be a task of the Casa da Arquitectura, with the help of professional historians and not the amateurs like us, the architectural historians, in compared to the hardcore historians. But I think it would be great to be able to interview systematically architects, contractors, political activists who made things happen, users, etc., in a rigorous way to have, in the end, an archive which would be perhaps more useful than paper in documenting these human experiences.
Yeah, very useful.
It's always extraordinary to finish with homework, if I may say. No?
Well, from production to archive and back.
With a lot of homework, yes, which is, I think, if I may close and thank you all very much. I think it's a very perspective take. Are we talking about research? Well, there are a couple of things you could do. Yes, thank you very much.
It's not over yet.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Obrigada a todos por se terem juntado a nós.
Thank you all for joining us. Please keep up with Casa da Arquitectura and visit us.
O que é que o público português nunca viu daquilo que da arquitetura portuguesa se mostrou em Veneza? Esse bairro Veneza vai ser feito, de facto, através de desenhos levantados. São desenhos grandes, são desenhos com muito detalhe, são desenhos a 1,15, que nós esperamos que sejam também uma espécie de quase casas de bonecas.
A grande importância desta exposição é permitir olhar para nós, portugueses, para a nossa arquitetura, como ela é vista lá fora, como é que os outros nos veem a nós. E é importante também que nós, enquanto país, consigamos perceber como é que a arquitetura representa Portugal e também deixa Portugal visto aos olhos do mundo.
Eu cheguei lá e vi aquela casa bonita e depois não se podia pôr um prego, portanto tive que inventar uns contrapesos e pôr aquilo tudo no ar. E a minha ideia, como aquilo é tudo falso em Veneza, é uma cidade completamente cenográfica, ventoriana, eu queria abrir um canal, abrir um canal em Veneza é muito mais importante do que fazer um edifício. Aquilo foi inaugurado sem nenhum espelho, lembras-te disso? Tinha um espelho. Colocaram um para dizer, isto vai ser assim. Tinha um. Foi das obras que mais gostei. E o escultor e o arquiteto entenderam sobre o material, sobre a vista falsa que um espelho dá, depois há a verdade do espelho. Eu adorei aquilo.
Tem sido um bocadinho uma surpresa o número de vezes que acabámos por ser convidados para participar diretamente na Bienal. São quase sempre perguntas. Como é que vamos viver juntos? Qual é a vossa luta no caso do Aravena? Há sempre uma inquietação que nos é transmitida e nós, no fundo, trabalhamos a partir dessa pergunta. E aí operamos com aquilo que é sempre muito interessante, que é a nossa liberdade é a nossa dificuldade. Continuamos a falar de arquitetura, mas, como na arte, não há nenhum problema para resolver. Ter a oportunidade de trabalhar sobre esta dúvida, sobre esta inquietação, sobre esta tensão, no contexto de uma Bienal, é obviamente muito estimulante.
Em 2016 recebemos uma carta do Aravena que perguntava, portanto a pergunta é, qual é a vossa batalha? Eu tinha feito paralelamente um trabalho com outro fotógrafo, o Paulo Catrica, porque tínhamos sido convidados para fazer uma exposição. Eu não conhecia bem o Paulo, mas portanto ele decidiu que iríamos trabalhar juntos e o Paulo foi lá ao ateliê, acabámos por ir para a Almirante Reis e mais uma vez eu disse, vamos mais uma vez trabalhar em paralelo. Tu vais fotografar este lugar, vais refletir sobre o que é para ti este lugar e nós vamos produzir uma mesa sobre a qual o teu trabalho vai ser exposto e essa mesa tem uma espécie de mapa-síntese do que é para mim aquele território. E o Paulo fez uma coisa que eu até hoje me persegue sobre a condição deste território.
Foi a primeira vez que houve uma secção de arquitetura na Bienal. A Europa-América foi organizado pelo Gregotti, convidou uma série de americanos, arquitetos americanos, e uma série de europeus. Os americanos eram bastante fechados, depois houve um debate muito quente no Lido, onde há um episódio de muita agressividade do Aldo Van Eyck em relação ao Tafuri. O Aldo Van Eyck fez a declaração de que ele era um inimigo da arquitetura. Foi mesmo muito violento e tal.